If you're struggling to dominate teams on Football Manager, even though you have a very good squad, you're not alone. I was in this situation with Atletico Madrid in La Liga, where Real Madrid and Barcelona tried to go unbeaten for 2 seasons. They almost did it anyway. But before they did their unbeaten run in those 2 seasons, I actually won the league. Now, as a content creator, I've studied over 250 Football Manager tactics. And in that time, I've seen a pattern of team instructions and player instructions that tend to work well in Football Manager. And it sort of gives you an edge over the AI and over other teams in the game, especially if you have a very good squad. But before you get to that point of actually implementing those sort of tactics, you need to do the groundwork first. So in this video, I'm going to share with you what you need to know to actually win more games and dominate teams on Football Manager. Now with Atletico Madrid, I have a pretty good squad, and despite my squad being this good, we had an average season. If you go ahead and look at the Spanish division, let's look at the preview, or you go over to stages, and then you see the current season that we're in right now. We've currently sitting in 5th place. I've gone on to make changes, but I'm going to show you that much later. The previous season, we only finished in 4th place, and we had a total of 74 points, while Real Madrid and Barcelona only lost to 1 game in the league, and they went on to have 107 and 101 points. And I knew why they did that. I wasn't as aggressive as I ought to be, and that's because I was leaning away from using overpowered instructions, overpowered tactics, that sort of stuff. So this was sort of intentional. But if you go all the way back to 2 seasons, you actually see that we went on to win the league, only losing 2 games all season. We had 96 points, and then we won 30 games. So in the next 2 seasons, I tried not to do that, and we didn't win anything. Now, the first thing I like to look at is the club's expectations. And when I was preparing for this video, I actually wrote this last, and I realized that it's actually one of the most important things you can do. So it's going to be first on the list. Know your club expectations. You can find this in the club vision or the club info part of the particular save. And currently with Atletico Madrid, without even doing too much research, you know that you're supposed to actually challenge for the title and beat Real Madrid or FC Barcelona to actually win the league. Now, we did that 2 seasons ago, but we weren't able to do it in the last 2 seasons. So there's a clear reason why it wasn't actually working. Well, one of the best teams in Spain except Real Madrid and Barcelona. So your main thing is for you to know that as a team, if you're expected to actually challenge for the title, you're supposed to start playing like a team that is supposed to challenge for the title. But if you're a mid-table team, you can't start playing like a Barcelona or a Real Madrid and then expect to dominate teams. If you have some certain instructions that tell your players to act in a certain way that is so expansive, you may go on to lose more games than you expect to win. But with Atletico Madrid, we are supposed to be dominant and oppressive and win more games. So that's where the shift is going to be. We stopped challenging for the title because I switched from a style of play that I was used to a different style of play to try and please the club supporters and the club board. Okay, the board was actually fine with it. I think it's the supporters that had the issue. So I tried to please the supporters and it didn't work out. So I'm never doing that again. We're going to do what works in the game, and that's exactly what you're here to learn. So let's get into it. Before we unbox the rest, if this is your first time of being on this channel, remember to hit the subscribe button so you can get notified when more Football Manager tactic videos do come out. I share my experience playing Football Manager to help other people learn and also to enjoy the game and alongside you guys. So now the first thing I encourage you to get is your staff. You need to get your staff sorted out. Get the best coaches that you possibly can with the money that you possibly have, and also the best scouts, people that can actually help you recruit good players. A good director of football as well is another thing that I recommend that you get. And also good physios, because if you want to play the style of play that we're going to talk about, you need to have your players fit. So you need good physios to actually help you keep your players in shape. The next thing we're going to talk about is your players, which I feel are one of the most important aspects of the game as well. But you can't really overhaul your players. You can't really get everyone out the door and get a new group of players back into the door. You're not Chelsea, but you can make an attempt to work on your recruitment and make sure it's strategic to get the kind of players that you want to come into the club. Players that are good at work rate, that have high intensity, high stamina, players that can run, players that have good pace and acceleration, because let's be realistic, Football Manager supports high running, high pressing, those sort of players. I think you know them if you've been playing this game for a while now. But if you don't, you can let me know in the comment section and I can recommend a new video, or we can work on a new video to help you find those kind of players. But if you're stranded and you've also sorted out your scouting and you don't really know how to find good players in scouting, I'm also going to attach a link in the description to help you get a tool that I normally use. I don't really consider this cheating per se, but you can use Genie Scout from FM Scout's website. It helps you find some of the best players, and you can also use to compare players between teams and kind of see what their core attributes hard-coded into the game actually is, so you can know which players are quite best for your team or players that are currently playing in another team. If they can fit into your style of play, I think you get the point. So I'm going to show you how Genie Scout works in a different video. Let me know in the comment section if you're going to be interested in that video. Now the next part we're going to talk about is tactics, and to me this is where you're going to implement all the overpowered instructions that I wanted to tell you from the beginning of the video. So I'm actually going to jump into Football Manager exclusively now. So I'll share with you all the formations, player roles and team instructions that I know that I've seen in previous 250 plus overpowered tactics that I've actually looked at and done research on. what actually works in the game, and how you can use it to your advantage. So for the tactics, I'm actually going to use a clean slate to show you how this actually works. Based on my experience of creating Football Manager content and studying all the Overpowered Tactics that I've gone on to test, for some reason, I don't think it really matters the formation that you're going to use, but let's assume you're going to use a 4-3-3 DM wide as your tactic. Let's assume that's what you want. I'm just going to clear out all the players. First of all, you want to get some balance into your team, and what I like to do is to have one player on the flank that is playing on attacking, another player on the flank that is playing on support. So let's say you have a wing, you have a fullback here. Let's say I'm going to ask my fullback to play on attack. I'll then opt to use an inside forward playing on support on that side. So the next thing I would look on this other side, if I have a wing back playing here on support VT, I can have a winger. Okay, since wing back and wingers are very similar to the way they play, I can use an inverted winger this time playing on attack DT, or I can even use an advanced playmaker. In my Atletico Madrid save, I had Adagula, which is a player that I like to use on the right hand side. You can see him here. Adagula is not really an inverted winger, he's more of an advanced playmaker, so sometimes it allowed me to use this role, playing an advanced playmaker on that side on attack DT, but let's just use an inverted winger on attack. Now I also recommend that you have one defensive midfielder on defend DT, or if you're not using a defensive midfielder, you have one of your midfielders actually play on defend. Let's say I was using a 4-2-3-1 like this, I would probably have my central midfielder play on defend DT. This other guy is going to be box to box, and then my number 10 can do whatever role that I want him to do. But since we're using a 4-3-3 now, I'm just going to drag this guy back and then have him play as a defensive midfielder, maybe on defend, then have my central midfielder playing on support DT. So you just have to have a balance between your roles. From what I've noticed, standard goalkeeper and super keeper sort of work the same way. You can have your super keeper play on support DT or defend DT, or you can have a standard goalkeeper. I think the changes really come when you switch it to a super keeper on attack. Maybe on support it can be a bit more expansive, but super keeper defense, super keeper standard, they are pretty similar to me. I also noticed in most Overpowered Tactics that they do have ball playing defenders playing on defend DT. So if you have a solid team, you have a big team, like Atletico Madrid, for example, you can go on to use ball playing defenders because your players will be able to play those kind of roles. Now, away from the player roles and the way they are kind of shaped up right now, by the way, before I forget, advanced forward on attack DT is the one that gets a lot of goals in this game. But most times I've used the pressing forward on attack. That sort of works well as well. But if you want to create space, you can use players like a deep lying forward on support or a false nine, which I think helped us in our title winning season. The season where we actually went on to win the league, we had a deep lying forward in there. We had a pressing forward also on support DT. But yeah, I wanted to jump away from the roles now. Let's get into the team instructions and team mentality. Beginning with the team mentality, you have what I noticed tends to work is an attacking mentality, where if you want a patient approach, you can go for positive. Cautious and defensive, I really kind of reserve that for games where you're sure that you're not the very good team in that game, and you can kind of keep it tight until the very end of the game. But I don't really recommend playing cautious and defensive all the time. It doesn't really help. It hasn't helped us in the last 2 seasons. So attacking and positive are the way to go. For team instructions, fairly wide. I think you can use narrow width and extremely narrow, but the title winning season that we had, we actually played very wide attacking width, but I'm not going to get into details of the formation for that one. So attacking width kind of depends on how you want to play. Do you want to play through the middle, or do you want to play through the wings? Where it gets tricky is in this position here. So you probably want to play out of defense, but if you don't have the players to actually do this, don't bother. It gets important when you have to play with your passing directness. As a big team in Atletico Madrid, we can play with standard and much higher tempo. It actually works out. I've seen almost 90% of the OP tactics that I've gone through actually have this set of instructions. If it's not like this, it's going to be slightly higher and then play out of defense. They also have low crosses selected, and they don't really walk the ball into the box. It's not mandatory, but you can turn it on during games. They also have the run at defense instructions selected for some of those tactics, not all of them. By the way, you can get through like this and then maybe have focus play on the left or right. It doesn't really matter. Once you have these 3 set up with the low crosses, you're sort of good to go. Maybe add run at defense if you want. But in transition, counter pressing and counter instructions are always selected. You don't want to give your opposition too much time on the ball, because they're going to actually use it. They will use the ball and then they will score you. So as a top team like Atletico Madrid, you want to impose yourself on teams. If you have a top team, semi-top team, you want to go at teams and impose yourself. You can choose to distribute quickly if you're trying to play fast counter, but if you're not, you want to just control games, you can just have it off and then have your goalkeeper take short kicks to any of your defenders or even a playmaker. Out of possession, you know the rule. Get high press, try to get in the opposition's faces, because if you don't, they will use the ball and then they will score you. So that's the way Football Manager sort of works, that I've noticed. And you want to press a lot more often, and maybe when you're being unsure of your pressing, you can drop it down to more often trigger press. But I think having it all the way on for a top team like Atletico Madrid helps. Maybe in a game against Real Madrid or Barcelona, you can then play with more often trigger press, but more usually you want to just go at teams and then oppress them. Get stuck in is plus or minus 50-50. You can have it on if you want. I would have it on because you want to get the ball back as often as possible. For the defensive line, I prefer leaving it on standard, or most OP tactics actually have it on standard. My preference would be to go one step higher to have a high defensive line, but let's just leave it in what actually works often in the game. So this is what you're going for if you're actually going to set up a team. Once you have a good relationship between your players and then you have this set of instructions that are in there, it could encourage your team to move the ball quickly and also try to keep it themselves and also not waste possession. It will also encourage them to get at teams, get the ball back as often as possible. While getting the ball, they're going to try to keep it. And when they're out of possession, the reference again is trying to get the ball back and play in the opposition's territory, force them off the ball. Now that you've got your tactics in place, you have to get the right relationship between your players, like I mentioned. And once that's done, you're good to go. The roles are constantly changing, so I do recommend that you have to tweak it once in a while, but don't change it too often. You have to actually keep some consistency in there. The next thing we're going to talk about is your squad dynamics. This to me is more important than most of the other tips that I mentioned, so it's almost like the tips are getting more important as we go down. But squad dynamics is so subtle, it's really subtle that you don't really notice it, but it affects everything in your team. Squad dynamics is basically the vibe in your club. If you keep your players happy, everything is going to go well. You can rotate players if you need to encourage them to stay positive and be part of the team, but you know that if your squad morale is low, it doesn't matter the tactic that you're using, your team is not going to play well. They're not going to train well, they're going to struggle. So your objective is to keep everything in the green as often as possible. And if you have all the other tips that I've recently just talked about working for you in the right direction, your team is going to be green anyway. Your morale is going to be good. Winning games also helps with squad dynamics and morale because your team is going to trust you a lot more that your system is actually working. So you can use team bonding to actually improve your happiness and team morale. Try to add team bonding to your training schedule every week as often as you can. And during training, go ahead and praise those players that are doing quite well. But winning games also helps you improve your squad morale. It's probably the one important thing that helps you increase your squad morale the most. And how do you actually win a match on Football Manager? Well, sometimes I feel the game is won and lost before you even step on the pitch. That's because during the match, a lot of things could go wrong. Red cards, VAR checks, penalties. These are things that you hardly even control. But before the game, you can actually study your opponent and know what to expect during the match. This already puts you one step ahead of the opposition. And it puts you one step ahead of most Football Manager players. I made a full video of how you can study your opponents on Football Manager. You can go ahead and watch that video next immediately after this one. It's super important. During the match, remember to use touchline shouts. Now I know in FM 2025 we'll no longer have touchline shouts, but now that we still have it, go ahead and use it because it actually works. Encourage your team when your team is playing well and they're trying to do a lot more and trying to get a lot more goals, but maybe it's not working. Try to encourage them. If they're already winning and then it's getting towards the latter stages of the game, remember to tell them to focus. And if your team is playing rubbish, berate them. It doesn't matter. I've had a lot of good goals come from berating my players. Immediately you just finish berating them, they go ahead and then they get a goal. I'm like, okay. On team mentality during the game, I don't really know how to give you advice on this one. I've spoken about it earlier before. What I'm going to say is I've had the experience where I switched to a defensive and a cautious mentality during the match and then we went on to win the game. I've had a situation where I played a whole match on defensive and then we went on to win the game. I've also had situations where I went defensive and it backfired. They actually scored us a lot more goals and then we lost the game. I have a situation where I was winning 1-0 and then I switched to defensive and cautious mentality and we ended up losing the game 2-1. So it's really down to you and your experience and what you think is going to happen. That it's really up to you to decide. But in my experience, it's 50-50 and you have to be careful. And what I can advise you to do is if you're switching to a cautious mentality or a defensive mentality, try to match the player roles in your team to that mentality. So you can have all your players playing on attacking and then you switch to a cautious mentality and most of your players are still on attacking. It doesn't really work like that. I think where I've had good success is when you switch to a defensive mentality, have a lot of players play on support or defensive mentality. Even on cautious, you have to switch those roles back. Even a pressing forward that is on attack duty, if you're playing on a defensive mentality now, you have to switch him down a bit to support, to try and help out the team in defense. So if I've missed anything, do let me know in the comment section. And if you have more questions about how to win on Football Manager, you can let me know in the comment section down below. So I'll see you in the next video about how we scout your opposition.